Thanks for joining today, everyone. Hopefully this will be fun and interesting for all, and hopefully we'll have some time for questions and also for folks to share their own ideas and as well in terms of how you go about doing season extension. So as Hillary said, I'm Dave Colson. I'm the Farmer Program Specialist, mostly working in southern Maine, but get around to various parts of the states. Not as much as I was before things kind of got shut down, but do like getting out to see what folks are up to. And that's my contact information, email, and the information for MOFGA up in Unity and the office phone number. So let's see. Okay, there we go. So why do some plants, why are some plants affected by frost and others not? And we have some cucumbers. I'm cheating a bit. These ones on the left are actually in our hoop house, and then chard and kale on the right. So basically plants need to transpire. Transpiring is kind of like us respiring, but since plants don't have lungs, they do need to take in moisture and air, and that moisture generally comes in through the roots of the plant, is drawn up through the stem and into the various leaves and the veins. And part of what happens, just as we need to, our skin respires so that we don't burn in the sun, plants also need to transpire. So evaporation off of the surface of the leaf keeps the leaf from burning. And that's often why this time of year when you see a plant wilt, it's kind of a physiological response to not having enough water. It's reducing its surface area that it has to transpire from. So, but something else happens during a frost or a freeze, which is basically that the surface of the leaf will get coated with frost or ice or snow, as the case may be. Typically, we think of this as those first really cold nights in, always seem to happen right around Common Ground Fair. And what happens is the surface water on the surface of the leaf is bound up in this frozen particles. Now, some plants are actually able to continue to transpire. They pull water up from inside the leaf to the surface of the leaf so that can evaporate and keep the plant from burning. But other plants will be damaged by frost, and they have less ability to move that moisture around in the leaf. So plants damaged by frost, we used to joke on our farm that all you had to do was walk up to a basil plant and whisper frost to it and it would die. So very susceptible. Others in this grouping, we found peppers actually with a simple cover sometimes, and sometimes even not covered would survive relatively well. Sweet potato is another one. You don't want to have frost. Its ability to store for very long is reduced quite a lot when it is frosted. Other plants like the crucifer family, broccoli, cabbage, cauliflower, kale. I've actually harvested broccoli and cabbage with layers of ice on them. So they will manage quite well. Lettuce and some leafy greens can get damaged more. What I have found sometimes in the past is that if the weather stays really warm and then suddenly you get a one cold night, a lot of things that you wouldn't think that would be damaged can be damaged. It's actually gentler on the plants for that cold to slowly creep in before you get too much of a cold. So plant protection from a light frost. What we're doing is trying to protect that frozen surface of the plant to allow it to thaw and begin to transpire. And the most critical point for that is right at sunrise, when the sun is just coming over the horizon, is hitting the plants, and can affect them. And what basically is happening, because they can't transpire, often when you go out and you look at those plants, it looks like they've been burned. And that's really what's happened, is the sun has hit those leaves. They haven't been able to transpire, and they're actually like a sunburn. So ways to protect the plants: watering is one way, covering the plants, or if you're growing in containers of some kind that you can bring. It doesn't even need to be into the warm house. It could just be into a unheated garage or some kind of cover, something to keep the plants from being damaged. And often what we find is that if we can make it through 1 to 2 nights of frost or that cold weather, will often be followed by up to 2 or 3 weeks of particularly good growing weather. So it's not that we're needing to protect plants for a long period of time, but just trying to get through those couple of frosts. The one thing I want to say about water, it's not often easy for folks to provide water. You don't necessarily want to put a lot of water out, but a lot of growers, for instance, strawberry growers in the spring, will have some light irrigation on strawberries to keep the frost off. And basically what you're doing is just providing a liquid water that can transpire early on. So in terms of different types of covers that could be used, really simply a tarp or a sheet or blanket, something not too heavy that can be thrown over the plants, a tablecloth, anything of that kind, just to protect them for that first 15, 20 minutes, half an hour as the sun's coming up and allows the air temperature to get up above freezing. Will give some amount of protection. Fabric row covers have gotten to be really popular. This is a one type. It'll give a few degrees of frost protection, and often that first frost, the temperature's just dipping into the maybe 32, 31, maybe getting down to 29, but often a simple cover will suffice. Clear plastic, solid clear plastic covers will give a little bit more degree of frost protection, but they can also overheat the plants as well under them. So you need to be ready to get those covers off pretty quickly. And then solid covers like a fiberglass frame or something like a cold frame can actually give you quite a bit of protection, but that also depends on how tightly sealed that solid cover is. So we're doing two things: keeping the sunlight off, but also trying to keep the cold out in that case. So different kinds of fabrics. The most popular fabric now that most folks are using is called Agribond, and it comes in a number of different weights. It has to do with it's kind of like fabric, the amount of weight per inch or something of that. My wife would probably know, being a sewist. Anyway, the Agribond or AG15 you might see around is really sold as an insect barrier. It's used to protect plants that you don't want to cross-pollinate. A lot of seed growers will use it. But for frost protection, we start with the AG19. It's the lightest and the most popular cover that's around. It can be used somewhat in the summer. It gives a couple of degrees of frost protection, and then the weights go down 30, 50, 70 and give these different degrees of frost protection. Typically, those are often sold as a floating cover that don't need support, but we generally have found that keeping the fabric off of the leaves does help in terms of frost protection. And if you're going to leave the cover on, which is one of the beauties of this type of cover, is that it does let air and water through it, and will also exclude insects, which is a nice thing about this use of this for season extension in the spring to get a bit of an earlier start, is that will also exclude things like flea beetles and other insects. But we found that a wire support is really helpful, and those are available either cut already in the sizes that you were looking for or coiled. And I've actually bought, they call it construction wire. It's a 9 or 10 gauge wire that is not galvanized, but is sold for putting into concrete foundations, tying pieces together. You can buy that a little more cheaply than the galvanized, but of course it won't last as long either. So here's again the cover put on the left, and then a picture of the wire hoop. And then we use these re-pins, these red pins with a loop on the top, which generally breaks off after a little bit of use, but they're helpful to pin down the cover. If you're going to get a lot of wind, the pins won't hold the cover generally well enough, so burying the edges or a sandbag or something like that may be preferable. So moving on to our raised beds. And I get a lot of questions about the raised beds themselves. A lot of people are looking to do this. And I get questions about how to go about making the bed. And often what folks end up doing who don't have a lot of space is they build a framed bed, and then they're looking for some soil to put in the bed. The way we go about it is we till an area first. So we've worked the area on the left, and I'm actually not using the area on the left for framed beds, but it is a tilled area next to my framed bed garden area that I could show you kind of how we do this. So we till an area, have it all tilled up, and then we lay the frames in and shovel excess soil in, and then at some point we establish the grass or the clover, low-growing clovers and grasses around the bed. So not bringing in soil, but using what we have in place. So the other thing we do is we've adapted some greenhouse, hoop house technology to help hold our beds. So in the previous picture, you can see a couple of pipes here, and there's 2 more at the other end. So what we do is we pound the pipe down into the ground. About 2 inches in from the end of the pipe, we drill a hole, and we use a carriage bolt. A carriage bolt has a smooth head to it so that it's flush with the board itself. And then we bolt that through on the inside. Oops, I'm sorry. Bolt that through on the inside of the bed. Now the reason for that is that this pipe does give the bed frame a little more structure, and it leaves a clean surface so that when you're running a lawnmower through the grass, you're not hitting the bolts themselves. So that's how the beds are built. Now, once to build the beds, I generally use a 2x10 hemlock. No special reason necessarily. I think they do last a little better. I would prefer prefer cedar, but that's often hard to get. But I found hemlock does relatively well, and if I can get a rough hemlock, even better. I have at times treated them with a boiled linseed oil before putting them into the ground. I'm not sure whether that would be approved for organic certification, but linseed comes from the flax plant, so it's basically a natural ingredient or natural product. And then the pipes are made from 2-inch by 16-inch metal conduit pipe, which is used for electrical conduit. I think those come in either 8 or 10 foot lengths, and we just cut those off, and then 3.5-inch carriage bolts. So now we have our bed built. In order to do a cover on this bed, we're using a white PVC 1/2 inch by 10 foot length of PVC pipe. These come in straight lengths. 10 foot is the standard length. We use the digging bar that you see on the left here to dig a hole, drive a hole down in the ground next to the bed. And then we insert the pipe on either side of the bed. So it kind of looks like this once they're all in. The PVC, this is a 12-foot bed, so each piece is 4 feet apart. And I find that this will actually hold up fairly well even under snow in the winter. So that's why we do the pipes as close together as that. Then on the ends of the bed, I prefer to use a rebar, which is a reinforcement bar that's used again in concrete. They hold up well, they don't break like a wooden stake does, but there's nothing wrong with using a wooden stake. I have found that I like to put an old tennis ball, cut a hole in the old one part of the tennis ball and slip that over the end of the rebar so I don't end up walking into it. Of course, the dog loves to pull the tennis balls off of the end of the rebar on me. So we pound the tennis bar at either, or the rebar at either end of the bed, and then we tie off the end of the fabric. Again, in this case, we're using a floating row cover type fabric, that Agribond type, and the rebar pins, and we pull that over the simple PVC frame that we've just built. This works really well. Again, spring or fall can be an exclusion type of thing for insects, and does give some pretty good frost protection. We also do the same thing with a clear plastic solid cover. This gives even more frost protection and is a little sturdier if, for instance, you get a bit of snow, or even we cover, in this case, I have some beds of perennial herbs on this side. We actually cover them with this type of hoop for the winter, and it holds up pretty well. Now, ventilation under the clear plastic cover you want to pay attention to, because it doesn't breathe like the row cover, the fabric covers do. So we create these notched boards, which I'll have a better picture of later. And they just hold a piece of that plastic up as we're trying to vent during the daytime. So we hold the plastic down with rocks in our case, because we have plenty of them. Sandbags would work as well. And then the picture on the right, you're looking through the opening through the other side. So we get some cross ventilation within the bed. And then of course you can pull the rocks on one side and flop the cover back over, and you have complete access to the bed, which is nice for working. So for this, we're using a 1/2 inch by 10 foot white PVC pipe. Straight pieces will easily bend, and they end up just staying in that curved shape after you've used them. The covers for this are 9 to 10 feet wide. We typically buy a 100-foot roll. The row cover fabrics may be hard to find in exactly that width, but for them, sometimes we're actually putting the pipes down into the ground a little deeper. Plastic covers, they come in the 9 or 10 foot length. If you can find UV resistant plastic, they'll last for many years. Construction grade will work, but they often won't stand up to being outside for long periods of time. Okay, then moving on into our framed bed cold frame, as we call it. What we do here.
Can I interrupt one question?
Sure.
Before you go on to that type. And it's coming from Margaret. She says, is something holding or securing the PVC pipe into the ground?
No, the PVC pipe is, we drive a bar or a digging bar into the ground, and just shove the PVC about 1 foot into the ground on each side.
Great, thanks.
Yeah, thanks for the question. It may be a little more, I have another slide in a bit that may be a little clearer. Yeah, so these, we're starting again with the wood framed bed. And what we wanted was something that was secure enough to really hold a snow load in the winter to protect perennials or overwintered, like our garlic or things like that. And what we had was some of these end pieces. These are 4 foot wide, 10 inch, or 4 foot long and 10 inch wide. And so we had some of those left over. So we cut triangles out of them like this. And one of them we attached a 2x4 on the bottom. So, whoops. Well, here we go. So those are nailed on. These are nailed straight through into the 2x underneath. And in this case, the 2x helps to hold the middle triangle up. It's nailed through the side. And then on top of that, we nail a piece of strapping. In this case, it was a 1x4. And it gives it some structure kind of back and forth, but it gives you something to attach the fabric to. So in this case, we're putting the fabric over the top, tacking it down with the strapping over the top, and then holding it on the edges with another piece of strapping. In this case, the strapping is just loose. It's not attached to the fabric, and it's not nailed to the bed itself, but it's usually heavy enough to hold the plastic down at night when we want the bed covered. And in the daytime, it vents pretty well, being this is a fabric cover. But if we want to vent it some more or get in there to work, we can throw the cover over one side and get into work one side of the bed. Or in this case, we can uncover the whole thing, kind of roll that cover up onto the peak, and it gives us great access to the whole bed. So this has been a really simple kind of technique. We already have the 4x12 foot bed, so it was relatively easy to build this little quick cold frame from that. Oops, wrong direction. And so utilizing that, let's see, where am I going? I'm going backwards. So utilizing that cold frame or cold protection area for winter, we nail more of those boards on to really create a little roof. In this case, I was covering perennials, cutting them back to fit underneath that cover. So once we have those boards all nailed on, it creates a nice little secure space for those plants to make it through the winter. And I'll move off of that picture because we don't want to start thinking about snow on the ground yet. So we also, moving on to the next piece, this is kind of using the same PVC technology and clear plastic row cover, but in this case, we're doing it in the open field. And so what we do when we go about doing this, we're again taking a 1/2 inch by 10-foot piece of PVC. We're using the digging bar, and we're driving a hole down into the ground about 12 to 14 inches. And then doing the same on the other side of our bed. Now, before we've done any of that, in this case, we want to create a way to hold the cover down to the PVC. So at 14 inches from the end of the PVC, we drill a hole large enough to slip a nail through. And then when we secure the PVC in, you can see there are strings that are run over the top. So they are tied down at the bottom of the, not on the end piece, but here on the side pieces like this, so that it goes through the nail and the hole in the PVC, and then it loops over and through the nail on the other side, and then back over and tied, so that it helps to hold the fabric down onto the PVC. And in this case, we only have, well, this is a 30-foot garden, so these are each 10 feet apart. You can add more in. 10 feet's about as far as I would probably go. I wouldn't go 10 feet to try and do a winter cover, but certainly for season extension, 10 feet works out fine. And we then are utilizing these notched boards, which we're also using in the wood frame beds to create ventilation in here. So generally, if we put a notched board on this side of this hoop, on the next hoop, it would be on the other side of the bed, which would give cross ventilation through the bed or through the cover itself. So that's what it looks like open. And a longer shot. And then again, if we want to get in there and work the bed or transplant or whatever you're doing, it's pretty easy to pull the rocks or sandbags and flop the plastic right over onto the ground. So for this, again, 1/2 inch by 10-foot PVC, you can get a gray conduit plastic that will work, but we found it doesn't hold up as well. They tend to break more quickly. We use a clear plastic sheeting. Again, UV resistance will hold up better. 10-penny nails are what we use to hold down the tie downs. And then the baling twine is what we use for our strings, rebars or wood stakes for the ends, and then notched boards for ventilation. So why don't I just pause for a second and see if there's any questions on all of that.
I'm not seeing any that have come in so far.
Okay.
Feel free to pop a few in the chat box if folks have any.
Sounds good. Thank you. So this was a number of years ago on our farm. We actually had an opportunity to go up in a balloon, and it was fun to take some aerial shots of the farm, but you can see kind of an extensive use of covers. We were using some early hoop houses we had built. Here are some of those plastic row covers. These are probably 48 footers. And here are using the full 100-foot length of those row covers. And you can kind of see how the up and down of the notched pieces create some ventilation in there. When my youngest child was still at home, she and I used to have a race where she would pull the notched boards out in the evening and I would come behind and put the rocks down. And so the race was to see if I could catch up to her as she was going along and pulling the boards out, which I never could. But it requires a little bit more work in terms of opening and closing the covers, but they do give some really nice protection for cold and wind. And then out in the bigger field, these are the fabric type row covers, and those are most likely covering broccoli, which we were doing a lot of at the time. Okay, so moving on. This is kind of the more solid cold frame type of thing that some folks might be familiar with. In this case, it's attached to a building that we have. We utilize the front of the building to use as the hinge to open the frame. So the key thing of this frame is the actual glazing frame itself, built out of 2x2 wood, just regular pine or spruce. And we put some bracing into the corners to give it a little more strength. They're fairly heavy, so having it hinged so that we can clip them. We have a eye hook here and a clip that comes off of the building to clip them in an open position, or they can be clipped down so that they ventilate, but they're protecting the seedlings. In this case, this was a cold frame for seedlings. Protect the seedlings from getting wet. But this particular type of frame really could be, you could have regular soil ground inside the cold frame that you could be growing things. And this is a pretty good one for even doing over the winter. Structurally, it's a little stronger. And because it does have this hinged type of thing, it's, unless the snow gets too awful deep, it's still relatively easy to lift up the cover. You kind of sweep the snow off and lift up the cover. I wouldn't do like we did though and put it on a part of the green or of a building where you're going to get a lot of snow coming off of a roof. Better to have this kind of thing on a gable end where more snow won't be dropping on top of the cover. Kind of a nice way to go. And again, these are built with a wood base underneath. We again use 2x10 hemlock. Again, securing them with that 2-inch by 16-inch metal conduit pipe. The cover is made out of a 2x2 wood frame with the corner supports. We cover it with either plastic or you can buy flat fiberglass, 5-ounce fiberglass in rolls that are 4x50. So it's kind of a perfect size to build a 4x8 size frame, which was the one that I had pictured. And sides, we have cut triangles out of fiberglass for the sides, or in the case of the one I had a picture of, it's just a plastic one. So plastic stapled into the side of the building. Here's the main frame in the front that's secured in the ground, and then the frame over the top. And then hoop houses.
Dave, we do have a couple questions about that last section.
Certainly.
Zach is wondering, were you growing during the winter using the solid cover on the side of the building?
Not in this. I've never used, this is primarily on our place used as a cold frame for seedlings in the spring. But I have seen this design used as a cold frame as well.
Okay, great. And then one other question from Sam says that they've heard that there's an interaction between the clear plastic cover and the PVC, which can degrade the poly cover. Have you heard that?
No, I have not experienced that. And again, what we generally have been purchasing is a UV resistant greenhouse cover. So we get them from a greenhouse supply company. Generally 10-foot wide is not a common width for those. So what we end up buying is a 20-foot wide width, and it's center folded. So there's a clear line down the middle that delineates 10 feet. So we roll it out and slice along that center line. So we end up with two 10-foot by 100-foot pieces. And I've used a number of those for many years and have not seen a reaction between the plastic and the pipe. Now, construction grade does not have UV resistance in it. That plastic is available in 10-foot widths at many hardware stores. What I find with that is that if it's on for a month or so during the season, it fairly quickly begins to break down in sunlight. So that may be as much of the problem as the PVC itself.
Great, thanks, Dave.
Cool. Thanks for the questions. So I'm not going to spend time on hoop houses, really. I think that could be a whole other talk in itself, and maybe kind of more than the backyard gardener would want to do, although some of these can be done in smaller sizes. these houses were some of our earliest ones. They're 17 foot wide by 96 foot long, but typically a hoop house comes with sections that are 4 feet apart. So these are called bows, and each bow is not driven into the ground like the PVC, but fit into the conduit pipe-like things that I was using for cold frames. So you can design a greenhouse based on any kind of 4-foot increment. So you could have a 12-foot wide by 16-foot long hoop house. That would be relatively easy to build. And in this case, we have a roll-up side on the hoop house that helps with ventilation. So we have doors on either end, and then this has a T handle, and the pipe here slides through the handle and allows you to roll that side up so that the greenhouse ventilates. One of the cool things that we have done for years with our hoop houses, I noticed on some field reports this week that folks are noticing tomato hornworms showing up. And hornworms do not winter over in Maine. The moth has to come up from further south. It's a very large moth, as you can imagine. And they tend to be kind of nocturnal flyers. So we found that if we closed up our hoop houses every night, or in the case of some of this PVC types of covers, like if you had bush tomatoes or peppers, you could use the floating covers, and it excludes the moth from being able to get in to lay the eggs of the hornworm, and so you don't see that damage from the hornworm. But anyway, hoop houses can be addictive. Be careful if you decide to start playing with them. They're a very interesting space to begin growing inside of. And then we have done some winter growing in one of our houses. This is our bigger house. It's a 30 by 96, built to withstand better built to withstand the winter temperatures. These ones have the Gothic, or what do they call it? Rounded. I'm not thinking of the word right now, but they're a rounded type of cover or frame rather than this Gothic shape, which sheds snow and holds up a little bit better in the winter. But here we are growing spinach during the winter, and again, using this simple PVC type cover on the inside. So we're covering individual beds on the inside to get a second layer of protection inside the hoop house. And if you've ever tried winter grown spinach, it's very, very good. And had to step out after one of the big rainstorms a couple of weeks ago and snap this shot of the rainbow over the backyard of the farm. So I hope that's it for my presentation. I hope that was helpful for folks, and I'd be happy to take questions. And I will once again put up my contact information too.
Awesome. Thanks, Dave. I want to mention to folks that you should feel free to unmute yourself if you want to ask a question that way. That totally works too. Or just type your questions into the chat box. I'm seeing a question from Karen. How much clear space is needed around a hoop house to allow enough light? Most of our lot is forested, and wonder how much space would need to be cleared to allow for a hoop house.
Yeah, good question. And of course, the amount of light would change depending on what time of the year you're focusing on. Obviously, the sun in the winter sky is much lower on the horizon than in the summer. One of the tips that we've learned over the years is in terms of the direction of siting your house. This isn't exactly your question, which I'll get to in a minute, but generally for winter growing, it's best to orient your house east-west so that the long side is facing south. That seems to give the best gain or sunlight to the house. In the middle of the summer, it doesn't seem to matter as much. I've had houses that were oriented north-south and things grew quite well in them. So siting your house and how much light it would need depends on the time of year that you're looking at. If you have a lot of trees to your south, they're going to cast a very long shadow in February, let's say. Whereas in June, they're going to be a much shorter shadow. So I don't know that there's a real specific space that would need to be cleared around. Some of that depends on how tall the trees are. But one thing you can do is make some observations during the year. And if you do have some open space, potentially how the sun moves in that space and what areas within the open space maintain sunlight during the time of year that you're interested in growing. Now, if you're really in a forested area, typically it would be roughly about double the, let's see, how does that work? Double the length of the height of whatever the south-facing tree line might be blocking you. So if it's a 40-foot tree, you may need to be as far as have space as long as 80 feet in order to not be shaded, if that makes any sense.
Thanks. Next question from Tavia. I'm sorry if I'm not saying that right. Wondering about high tunnels. They've been hearing about high tunnels. Can you explain what those are?
Those were what I guess I can't get my screen to advance back and forth, but high tunnels are those PVC or plastic covered greenhouses like I was showing pictures of. They're so generally there are three terms that we use interchangeably somewhat: high tunnel, hoop house, and greenhouse. I generally consider hoop houses and high tunnels to be basically the same thing. Generally, I consider something to be more of a greenhouse when there's some kind of heat source added in. So you could have a high tunnel that you add a heater to, and then it miraculously becomes a greenhouse. But basically, they're all steel framed metal piping over which you stretch plastic, and they can come in any kind of different sizes. Now, back in the 80s, when we started playing around with, we were using the PVC hoops, the short hoops in our fields, and we started to play around with using 1.5 inch PVC that was 20 foot long, and making a wood frame for them to sit in, and we started planting tomatoes into them. And it was amazing how much better the tomatoes did inside this little protected area. That's a relatively simple type of frame to build, but again, it won't hold up to winter. It would really be for just spring, fall kind of use. The metal framed ones, you're driving a ground post into the ground that the bent pipes or the bows fit into to create the structure of the building. And then there's usually one or more purlins or metal pipe that runs the length of the house that helps to create some structural stiffness to the structure itself.
Great. A question about using a sprinkler. Can you use a sprinkler when you have when you're using row coverings for overhead watering?
Not for the clear plastic, obviously, because that would shed the water, but for the fabric row covers, yes, you can, the water will go through. So rainfall will go through, and sprinklers will go through. We have we do a little bit of drip irrigation, primarily in our hoop houses or high tunnels. But in the field, we have overhead pulse irrigation, and we run that right over the top of the fabric row covers. Works fine.
Cool. Another question about watering. How do you know how much to water plants grown in the winter? With less ventilation in greenhouses, are you more likely to have problems with mildew and such from watering?
That's a really good question. I think last winter we had more than spinach in the house. We actually, one of the nice things, I guess first I'll say, one of the nice things about a bigger volume house. So I mentioned some of our earlier houses were 17 feet wide by 96 long. And they were roughly 12 feet high. And see if I can get back to a picture. It would be easier to show. Let's see. Let's go to this one. See if I can move that. So these were 17 foot wide and 96 long, but they were only about 12 feet to the peak. Now the bigger one here is 30 feet wide, but it's only 15 feet to the peak, so just a little bit higher than the other one. So the actual volume inside this house is much greater. You would think that the bigger house would lose warmth more quickly. But what we found is that inside the house, some of these center beds here actually stayed warm enough that we could grow leaf lettuce through the winter. And we actually had cilantro that survived the winter in some of the center beds. So the bigger volume house does give you a little bit more of a heat advantage. I think it's basically because here's the side wall, that the frost will move in from the sidewall, or the actual cold ground will move in. And it doesn't seem to penetrate all the way into the middle of the house. So the middle of the house stays a little bit warmer. But the question was around watering. And typically I find that we water the houses in when we're planting them. And often we're not getting to doing our winter planting until sometime between middle of November and early December. They don't do a whole lot of growing over the dead of the winter. Elliot Coleman's book, Four Season Gardening, has a lot of good information on timing of when to plant things. If you want an actual winter harvest of greens or spinach or other things, you need to start them earlier in the fall. And what's actually happening is they're growing almost to this kind of size you see, and then physiologically they slow down dramatically. It takes twice as long to grow out a spinach plant in the winter as it does in the summer. And in a sense, for most of December and January, you're holding the plants almost in a little cooler inside this greenhouse. They aren't growing a whole lot, but you can go out and harvest at various times. What we find happens is that right around Groundhog Day, the beginning of February, the amount of light has changed dramatically. It's only another 5 weeks or so till the spring equinox, which we begin to get 12 hours of daylight. And so plants physiologically really take off at that point. They're suddenly growing a whole lot more. And generally what I've found is that we water in the fall when we're putting plants in. Maybe we'll water some into November or December, and then they don't really need water through most of the winter. And then once we get more heat and more sunlight in February, then we will generally start to begin watering a bit more then. But that was a really good question, because winter hoop houses, you can easily oversaturate the ground if you water too much.
Great. Thanks, Dave. I have a couple of questions that are kind of related. One, wondering if you could run through maybe your top recommendations for which crops to plant for winter harvest. And then somebody else wondering if you have suggestions for lesser known vegetables that can handle some frost.
So we're working on season extension. What's interesting is how season extension has slowly worked its way into year-round growing, and it's kind of cool. It is kind of fun to be able to pull things out of a hoop house or greenhouse in the middle of winter. It's also challenging in terms of getting out and working things. And there are times when, if you're growing commercially, you have sales that you want to make, but the weather isn't cooperating and things stay really cold for a couple of days. And you want to give the plants a chance to warm up in the daytime before you start picking them, because a frozen lettuce or spinach leaf does not hold up very well after picking. So giving the hoop house a chance to thaw out to potentially get just slightly above freezing is really beneficial. And in terms of different plants to grow, I found the simplest to be spinach. Seems to do really well, quite easy to do. The one thing folks are starting to run into these days is a downy mildew on spinach. And typically we don't see much downy mildew in Maine, but conditions in the hoop houses can be perfect for it to get started. And unfortunately, we're also seeing it become more prevalent as a summer disease. And I wonder if some of that isn't because of the amount of spinach that's being grown in high tunnels in the winter. But so if you want to do spinach, look for the downy mildew resistant varieties. Those are the better ones to go with. Other things that do well, we've, as I said, we've had some success with lettuce. I had one planting of lettuce that I think we cut off for almost 5 months over the winter. And again, that was planted more to the center of the bed where it's a little bit more protected. A lot of the crucifers will do quite well. The kale, of course, for leafy things. And there are some overwintering broccolis that will actually do pretty well. They don't usually form their heads until sometime in April or perhaps even May. So it gets a little late into the spring season. Another one that a lot of people do is a very small little delicate salad plant is called mosh. And it's actually very sweet. very, very delicious little green. You wouldn't think it would be so hardy, but it is extremely hardy. Um, some of the chicories will do pretty well, radicchios, things like that. Um, and then some other things, chard or larger leaf kales, if you get them started early enough in the season or in the uh, fall, you can actually pick some larger leaves off of that as well. Um, and sorry, you'll have to repeat the other half. Was something about other varieties?
Yeah, this person wondering if you had suggestions for lesser known vegetables that can handle some frost.
Um, lesser known vegetables. Well, in the beginning, I did give a list of a number of the ones I think of as being frost tolerant. Typically, I, a lot of the things that we start playing with, I guess, in the fall uh, are somewhat alternatives to our summer salads. So obviously things like tomatoes and peppers and zucchinis and cucumbers and all those summer salad kind of things can't handle the cold. So we begin to think about our salads a little bit differently. We love scallions. We grow them in clumps most through the whole year. They will overwinter really easily and give you something nice in the spring as a spring onion. But we put them into under covers or into the hoop house in the winter and are able to pull them at different times during the winter. And this kind of the same with things like turnips and radishes. There's some really wonderful new variety. It's probably not that new. We're just rediscovering some older varieties like watermelon radish or Hakori turnip. Um, and they generally get much sweeter as you go into the colder season and make a really nice kind of colorful addition to fall and winter salads. Um, so those would be kind of my suggestions. It's kind of thinking a bit outside the box in terms of what it is will grow and what you enjoy eating during the kind of the wings of the growing season.
Great. A couple of comments came in about the topic of plastic sheeting reacting with PVC pipe.
Mm-hmm.
Not a question exactly, but Margaret sharing that polyethylene greenhouse film used over polyvinyl chloride pipes may or may not react with the PVC, degrade, lose its integrity, and tear. And that Johnny's doesn't recommend the use of tough light IV film for any applications in direct contact with PVC. I don't know if you want to say anything further about that.
No, all I can say is what I've experienced in terms of using some of the different covers, and I certainly respect Johnny's thinking on that.
Yeah, it's interesting.
Yeah.
Okay, we've got a question about leaving carrots and parsnips in for winter harvest. Does it help to have them covered? Is that something you would recommend doing?
Yes, thank you for bringing that up. That was another one I was going to mention. Elliot Coleman's book does talk about, I think the carrot does a variety is a candy carrot, and he seeds them into the greenhouse. I don't remember the timing, but I think it was either late fall or early spring, and harvests very sweet carrots in the early spring. And parsnips are famous for overwintering. Generally, a parsnip will have converted more sugars when it's harvested in the spring. And so they, depending on your particular location, most plants don't like to be sitting either with what folks call their feet wet, meaning that their roots are in water, or if they're in too much water and the water is frozen, which is part of the reason we use those different kinds of covers over our wood framed beds, because they can fill up with water in a rainstorm or with snow melt, and then you get these little ice skating rinks in there. And so they're less than ideal for trying to overwinter plants. But if you can protect them somehow from too much water or too much freezing, parsnips seem to do pretty well. Carrots, I've never had carrots overwinter straight in the open field without some kind of mulch or covering over them. And I know some people use a heavier grade fabric cover as kind of their cover for those, rather than like putting straw down or something like that. And they'll do, it'll do a fairly good job of helping to protect them. Because often what happens with plants in the winter is well, I talked a bit about the physiology of what frost does. So the actual freeze, once you get to a certain point of the winter, is plants will get so cold that the moisture inside the cell will actually freeze, and as the water freezes, it expands and it breaks the cell wall of the plant, and that's eventually what kills a lot of our more hardy annual plants. But let's see, what was I going to say about that? So we want to kind of protect. I know is so what happens a lot of times with some plants like perennials is that it's not so much the absolute cold that kills them, it's the drying out and the wind in the wintertime. So like rosemary, for instance, won't overwinter in Maine at all, but I've seen it go through below zero temperatures in California and Arizona and be just fine. And that's because those temperatures drop to that degree for a short period of time, like we see in the fall. And then they warm up again during the daytime, and they don't get the drying winds. So rosemary won't winter over at all in our climate, but other things like sage and thyme, savory, it's more that desiccating winter wind that's going to damage the plant. And so having some kind of protection over them will help their survival rate.
Along the same lines, somebody else asked, what else can overwinter besides carrots or parsnips? Is there anything else?
I'm sure there are. I'm not coming up with much of a list at this point. I think with some protection, there's a lot more things that will. As I mentioned, a lot of the allium family, the onions and leeks, scallions, things like that, with some protection will overwinter. One of the interesting things with onions is that we need to grow a different type of onion over the winter if you're going to do it in a hoop house, because onions are keyed into forming their bulb by the day length. And so our onions, most of the varieties we grow in Maine, they begin to form their bulbs as the daylight is diminishing. Whereas the varieties they grow in the winter down south are keyed to begin developing their bulbs as the day length lengthens. So there are some folks that are beginning to play with winter grown onions in hoop houses but they have to grow the southern varieties that will bulb at in the correct way. So yeah, onions, leeks, scallions in a protected space will do pretty well. And as I mentioned, cabbages, broccolis, cauliflowers, I think of those more as needing to be started in the fall and kind of overwintering rather than really doing much growing in the winter. But in terms of straight out in the field, maybe you can think of some, Hillary, but I'm kind of drawing a blank there.
You had success with parsley?
You have had?
What, I wonder if you have. I have, just on a home scale, a couple of times managed to keep one alive, but
Uh-huh.
I'm not sure if that's a common one.
Yeah, well, parsley's in the same family as carrots and parsnips. So, and it's a biennial. So normally it would want to overwinter in order to flower the second year. Often we've either grown it in a covered space. Same with the cilantro. I was amazed at how well the cilantro did through last winter in our hoop house.
That's
Um,
amazing.
yeah, but what will happen with both of those is that once they start to develop in the spring, they're going to want to go to seed because particularly parsley is a biennial. And there's nothing wrong with letting it go to seed. You can collect seed from it. The flowers are actually really great for beneficial insects. So actually kind of something that's kind of fun to have in the hoop house. The one caveat I would have about bringing plants in, and we used to put our rosemary out in the summer and then bring it in for the winter, or parsley we would dig and pot off and bring it in for the winter. But one of the things that happens with those perennial or biennial plants is that aphids will often move on to those as winter hosts. So most of the plants that the aphids go for in the summertime die in the winter, and so they somehow know to move on to these other plants that have more potential to be able to live through the winter. And what we found in some cases with digging up parsley and bringing it inside is we were also bringing in a banker of aphids that ended up exploding in our more year-round greenhouse. So you do want to be careful of doing that.
Oh, gee. Yeah, that's not good. Mary is suggesting that she's tried soup celery through the winter. And I did miss a question from a little earlier on. One person asking, was there plastic over the cold frame in the photo that you showed where there were the boards and it was covered in snow?
Yes.
Okay, great.
Go back to that. Yes, so what I used to use was a clear plastic cover, but we've now gotten to using the Agribond. I've been using the AG30, which is pretty strong stuff, and there's AG50 and AG70 as well. What I like about them is that using a solid cover over this requires you to do some ventilation. If you, for instance, have garlic under this, and what we like to mulch our garlic with leaves because we aren't bringing in weeds. If they're mulched pretty well, it won't stimulate too much growth. But the asparagus that you see next to this bed, even if it's mulched and it has a clear plastic over it, as soon as the snow melts off in the spring, you've really created a little greenhouse, and it's going to get quite warm in there. we've had the asparagus start to grow, and then frost or cold temperatures end up killing, they don't kill the asparagus, but they kill the new sprouts coming out of the ground. So that's why we've begun to use more of the Agribond type, because some of the heavier ones are strong enough to hold the snow and the wind and all of that, but they do breathe, so they don't need as much attention in terms of covering and uncovering on warmer days in the spring or the fall.
Awesome. We've got a question about pollination. How do you handle pollination when you're using row covers in the field?
Good question. Another good question. Well, some things that may be injured by insects don't need pollination. So lettuce we don't cover with row cover. Tarnished plant bug has been a really tough insect this year, and it will go after lettuces. But we generally we haven't covered our lettuce. The other mustard type greens, arugulas, mustards, kales, tatsoys, those kind of things seem to be flea beetle magnets. So we would grow them under row cover for their whole lifespan. And they don't need pollination since we're cutting leaf for that. But for things like cucumbers or peppers or squashes, winter squashes, all those kind of things, you're absolutely right. They do need to be pollinated. So generally what I do for row covers when I'm doing insect exclusion is that, particularly for the squashes and cucumbers and melons and everything in that family, we find that transplanting them, covering them for about their first month gives them a good opportunity to establish themselves. And then usually about a month in, 4 weeks in, you'll start to see the yellow flowers beginning to show. And at that point, we think about uncovering. One interesting thing is that curcubits have a male and a female flower. They're easier to see on a zucchini or a squash because the blooms are larger. But the flower that you see with what looks like a little fruit on the end is the female flower, and then the males will have a long stalk with no fruit-looking thing. And generally, it's the male flowers that show up first. So often, seeing the yellow through the hoops through the cover does not necessarily you missed your early pollination, as it's usually the males that are showing up first. But yes, that is important to get them uncovered. And in some cases, particularly for hoop house tomato growers who may be using some heat in houses, and therefore not wanting to open the house to pollinating insects, some hoop house tomato growers are now purchasing bumblebee hives, small bumblebee boxes, and having them in the house in order to do early season pollination.
Wow. Unless I'm missing something, I think that we've gotten to all the questions that were thrown in the chat box. If anyone has anything else they'd like to add, feel free to unmute yourself or throw your question into the chat. Otherwise, maybe we'll tie things up.
I'd like to say that I knew nothing of any of this, and I really appreciate how thorough your talk is. I would attend a talk of yours again.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Yeah, and I think the takeaway, and for me, none of this was, well, these wood frame covers, I guess I'll take credit for those. But The PVC I actually learned about from a grower in California about 40 years ago who was using it for netting to be able to grow lettuce in the summertime in the heat of California. Maybe we'll start to need that here with how hot our summers are getting. But all of these ideas are kind of brainstorms of one person or another. And I think one of the great things at MOFGA is the willingness to share ideas with each other, and you know, what kind of things we've thought about and what kind of things work for the things that we're trying to do. And I've really appreciated that all the years that I've been involved with MOFGA, just how sharing the farmers and gardeners around the state are. And the other thing is, I tend to, at least initially, stay away from expensive purchases of things, and try to come up with like homemade solutions, such as this simple kind of framing over a bed. Of course, we ended up going to pretty large commercially built hoop houses eventually, but that was a path that we went down over a number of years of trialing kind of other things and seeing what worked, and realizing that maybe the commercial structure at some point made sense for us. But none of this necessarily requires fancy equipment or fancy structures. Mostly what we're trying to do is just to help create a little more conducive environment for those plants to grow in. And sometimes it may be just tucking your plants into a corner of a warm section of a building where they will get an earlier start in the spring, or be able to go a little later in the fall. So thanks everyone for participating or for listening today. And I'd love to hear some of the things that other folks have come up with for ideas of things that have worked for you as well, because I think it's fascinating, and it's something I'm always learning tricks on as well.
We're getting lots of comments, lots of thanks in the chat box. A few people have mentioned to me that they're going to try some of these techniques this fall for the first time. So that's really, really great to hear.
Good. And I'll put my contact information up again, in case anybody would like to send me photos or ideas or thoughts. Always happy to hear from folks.
Awesome. Well, thanks a lot, Dave. This was really great. And thanks to everyone who joined today.